Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of Ontario, where 10 true encounters with the unexplainable will test everything you thought you knew about what lurks in the shadows of this province. From abandoned farmhouses hiding unspeakable secrets to lakeside properties where things that should not exist have been seen rising from the water. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are real experiences from real people who live to tell their stories. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us step into the shadows of Ontario's most disturbing true horror, where ordinary lives collide with extraordinary terror. Everyone in Thunder Bay knew about the Hartley property, even though most people had not driven past it in years. The farmhouse sat about 20 kilometers outside the city limits on the old highway that used to connect logging camps before they built the newer routes closer to Lake Superior. My Uncle Derek had owned those 87 acres since the late 1970s, working the land until his health failed in 2018. When he passed away that November, I was the only family member left to inherit it. I had just turned 29 and was working a dead-end job at a shipping warehouse in Winnipeg when the lawyer called with the news. The property came with the house, 2 barns, and enough back taxes that I would need to sell it quickly or figure out how to make it profitable again. I chose the latter, mostly because I needed a fresh start after my divorce, and the idea of isolation appealed to me more than I wanted to admit. I arrived in Thunder Bay on a gray March afternoon in 2019, the kind of day where the sky and the lake blend into one endless sheet of steel. The drive out to the property took longer than I remembered from childhood visits, and when I finally turned onto the gravel lane, I was struck by how much the forest had reclaimed the edges of the fields. Uncle Derek had stopped farming actively around 2015, according to the neighbors, just keeping a few chickens and maintaining the buildings enough that they would not collapse entirely. The farmhouse itself looked tired but salvageable, with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch that groaned under my weight when I climbed the steps to unlock the door. The first few weeks were exactly what I expected. Cleaning out decades of accumulated belongings, sorting through paperwork in the office where Uncle Derek had kept meticulous records of every seed purchase and equipment repair since 1979. I found boxes of old photographs showing the property in its prime, when the fields stretched golden under summer sun and the barns were freshly painted red. There were pictures of Uncle Derek as a younger man, always alone, always serious, standing beside tractors or holding tools. He had never married, never had children, and as far as I could tell from talking to the few neighbors who still lived nearby, he had kept to himself for most of his life. The main barn needed the most work, so I started there in early April, once the snow had melted enough to make the walk from the house manageable. It was a massive structure built sometime in the 1950s with hand-hewn beams and a loft that still smelled like hay despite being empty for years. I was clearing out the ground floor, hauling broken equipment and rotted wood to a burn pile, when I noticed something odd about the concrete foundation along the north wall. There were seams that did not match the rest of the floor, like someone had poured new concrete over an older section, and the color was slightly different. Darker, almost. Rust-tinted in places where water had pooled and dried over the years. I told myself it was probably just repairs Uncle Derek had done at some point, maybe fixing cracks or reinforcing the foundation. But something about those seams bothered me enough that I mentioned it to Frank Murdoch, the neighbor who lived about 5 kilometers down the road and who had known Uncle Derek for 40 years. Frank came by one Saturday to help me assess what equipment might still be worth salvaging, and when I showed him the concrete, his expression changed in a way that made my chest tighten. He said Uncle Derek had poured that section himself back in the winter of 1987, claimed he needed to fix drainage issues that were causing the barn floor to crack, but Frank remembered thinking it was strange that Derek had done the work alone, at night, during one of the coldest February stretches on record. He had offered to help, but Derek had refused, saying he preferred to work at his own pace. Frank also mentioned that 1987 was the same year a man named Vincent Kowalski had disappeared from Thunder Bay, a local mechanic who had been involved in some trouble with the wrong people and whose body had never been found. I tried to push the conversation out of my mind, focusing on the practical work of getting the property ready to either sell or lease to someone who actually knew farming. But over the next few weeks, I kept finding things that did not add up. There were gaps in Uncle Derek's records from 1987, months where he had not logged any expenses or activities, despite meticulous entries before and after that period. I found a newspaper clipping tucked into one of his ledgers from March 1988, a brief article about the Kowalski case going cold, with a handwritten note in the margin that just said, "Let it rest," in Uncle Derek's distinctive angular script. By late May, I could not ignore the feeling that I was living on top of something terrible. I started having dreams about the barn, about sounds coming from beneath the concrete, about shadows moving in the loft where no one should be. The isolation that had seemed appealing in March now felt oppressive, like the forest was closing in around the property, and the silence was full of things I did not want to hear. I called the Thunder Bay Police non-emergency line on a Tuesday afternoon, feeling ridiculous as I tried to explain my concerns to the dispatcher. I told her I had suspicions about old concrete work in my barn that might be connected to a missing person case from 1987, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice when she said an officer would come out to take a statement. Detective Sarah Chen arrived 2 days later with a younger officer whose name I did not catch. She was patient as I walked them through everything, showing them the concrete seams, the gaps in the records, the newspaper clipping. She took photographs and asked questions about my uncle's habits and personality, whether he had ever mentioned Kowalski or seemed troubled by anything from his past. I told her the truth, that I barely knew him, that our family had not been close, and most of what I understood about his life came from sorting through his belongings after death. They called me the following week to say they were bringing in a ground-penetrating radar team, that my suspicions warranted further investigation based on some information they had about the Kowalski case that was not public knowledge. They arrived on a Monday morning with equipment I had only seen on television crime shows, setting up a grid pattern on the barn floor and running the scanners slowly across the concrete. I watched from the doorway, feeling sick to my stomach, knowing that whatever they found would change everything about this property and my connection to it. The radar showed anomalies beneath the concrete in 3 locations, shapes that were consistent with what Detective Chen carefully described as potential remains. They brought in excavation equipment that afternoon, breaking through the concrete I had walked across dozens of times since March, removing chunks to reveal the dark earth underneath. I stood in the yard with Frank Murdoch, who had driven over when he saw the police vehicles, and we did not speak as the hours stretched into evening. They found Vincent Kowalski around 7 in the evening, his body wrapped in tarpaulin and plastic sheeting that had deteriorated over 32 years underground. But they also found 2 others, both unidentified, buried in similar fashion within a few feet of each other. Detective Chen emerged from the barn with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of professional composure and genuine horror, and told me this was now a multiple homicide investigation, and I would need to find somewhere else to stay while they processed the scene. The Thunder Bay Police brought in forensics teams from Toronto and the Provincial Police Major Crimes Unit. Over the next week, they excavated the entire barn floor and discovered a total of 5 bodies, all buried between 1987 and 1994, according to the preliminary assessments. The local news picked up the story within days, describing it as one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in Northern Ontario history. Reporters camped at the end of my driveway, asking for interviews, wanting to know if I had suspected my uncle was capable of murder, if there had been warning signs I had ignored. The truth was more complicated and more disturbing than I could explain to strangers with cameras. Uncle Derek had never been charged with anything in his life, had no criminal record, no history of violence that anyone could find, but Detective Chen told me during one of many interviews that the investigation had uncovered connections between the victims and a criminal network that had operated in Thunder Bay during the 1980s and early 1990s, moving drugs and engaging in enforcement activities that often ended in people disappearing. They believed Uncle Derek had either been part of that network or had allowed his property to be used as a disposal site, possibly under duress or in exchange for money he desperately needed to keep the farm running. They identified 3 of the 5 victims by late summer through dental records and DNA. Vincent Kowalski was the first, followed by a woman named Rebecca Timmons, who had disappeared from a Thunder Bay apartment in 1989 and whose family had never stopped searching for answers. The third was a man from Toronto with ties to organized crime who had been reported missing in 1991. The other 2 remained unidentified, their remains too degraded and their dental records not matching any missing persons reports on file. I sold the property in October 2019 to a developer who planned to demolish everything and subdivide the land for residential lots. Though I have heard that project stalled when potential buyers learned about the history. I took a loss on the sale after legal fees and the costs of dealing with the investigation, but mostly I just wanted to be done with it, to sever any connection I had to that place and what my uncle had been involved in. Sometimes I still think about those months living on the property, walking across that barn floor without knowing what was beneath my feet, sleeping in a house where a man who had helped hide murders had lived for decades. Detective Chen told me there was no evidence Uncle Derek had killed anyone himself, that he had likely been a facilitator, someone who provided a service to dangerous people in exchange for something he needed. But that distinction does not matter much when I close my eyes and remember the smell of that barn, or the rust-colored stains in the concrete, or the absolute silence of those northern nights when I was alone with secrets I did not yet know existed. Moving into the Caldwell house in Perth felt like stepping into a postcard from another century. The limestone mansion sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, its Victorian architecture perfectly preserved with tall windows, ornate woodwork, and a wraparound porch that overlooked the Tay River just 2 blocks away. I had been searching for an affordable rental in Eastern Ontario for months while working remotely for a Toronto marketing firm, and when the listing appeared in late September 2021, I could not believe my luck. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, period details throughout, and rent that was almost too good to be true for a property of that size and character. The landlord, an older man named Richard Caldwell, explained during our phone conversation that the house had been in his family since it was built in 1858, and he preferred to rent it to someone who would appreciate its history rather than trying to modernize it into something it was not meant to be. I signed the lease without ever seeing the property in person, which my sister said was reckless, but I was desperate to escape my cramped Toronto apartment, and the remote work arrangement made location less important than usual. Richard met me on move-in day in early October, a distinguished-looking man in his 70s who walked with a cane and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing his words thoughtfully. He gave me a tour that lasted nearly 2 hours, pointing out which floorboards creaked, where the original servant's staircase led to the second floor, which windows tended to stick in humid weather. He mentioned almost casually that his grandmother had been the last family member to actually live in the house full-time, passing away in 1994, and that since then it had been rented to a series of tenants who rarely stayed more than a year or 2. When I asked why people left so quickly if the house was in such good condition, Richard paused at the base of the main staircase and said some people found the isolation difficult, that living in such an old building alone required a certain temperament. The way he said it made me think there was more to the story, but I was too focused on carrying boxes inside to push for details. That first week felt like a dream. I spent my evenings exploring downtown Perth, a town that seemed frozen in the 19th century with its stone buildings and historic plaques on every corner. The house itself was a joy to inhabit, with rooms that caught the afternoon light perfectly and enough space that I could set up a proper home office in one of the spare bedrooms upstairs. The first incident happened on my 8th night there. I woke around 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. My first thought was that Richard had come by to check on something, and I had somehow not heard him knock or enter. But when I opened my door, the hallway was empty and completely silent. I checked every room on the second floor, then went downstairs to make sure all the doors and windows were locked, which they were. I told myself I was still adjusting to the sounds of an old house settling, that the footsteps were probably just the heating system expanding pipes or something equally mundane. But the footsteps came back the next night, and the night after that, always around 3 in the morning, always in the upstairs hallway. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping with earplugs and trying to convince myself that this was normal for a building that was over 160 years old. Things escalated in mid-October when I started noticing temperature changes that made no sense. I would be working in my office, perfectly comfortable, and suddenly the room would become so cold I could see my breath, only to return to normal temperature within seconds. This happened multiple times a day, with no pattern I could identify, and always accompanied by a feeling that I was not alone, that someone was standing just behind me watching over my shoulder. I called Richard after a particularly unsettling afternoon when every door on the second floor slammed shut simultaneously while I was downstairs making tea. He listened to my concerns with what sounded like genuine sympathy and suggested I might want to speak with the Perth Historical Society, that they could provide context about the house's past that might help me understand what I was experiencing. When I pressed him directly about whether the house was haunted, he said that several previous tenants had reported unusual occurrences, but that he had never personally experienced anything that could not be explained rationally, and that the house had been thoroughly inspected and maintained to modern standards. The Historical Society meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the basement of a church near the town center. I spoke with a woman named Margaret Fenton, who had researched the Caldwell family extensively for a book she was writing about Perth's founding families. She told me the house had seen significant tragedy over the decades. In 1873, 2 of the original owner's children, both daughters aged 7 and 9, had died of scarlet fever within days of each other. In 1921, a maid employed by the family had fallen from a second-story window under circumstances that were never fully explained, with some suggesting accident and others whispering about suicide. And in 1967, Richard's own mother had suffered a mental breakdown while living in the house, claiming she could hear children laughing in empty rooms and see a woman in a long dress standing at the windows watching the street. Margaret showed me newspaper clippings from various eras, accounts of unexplained phenomena at the Caldwell house that stretched back to the late 1800s. One article from 1912 described how servants refused to work in certain rooms, particularly the nursery on the second floor, which had belonged to the 2 girls who died. Another from 1968 detailed Richard's mother's hospitalization and included a quote from her doctor saying she had become convinced the house was trying to communicate with her, though he attributed this to her declining mental health rather than any supernatural cause. I returned home that night feeling both validated and deeply unsettled. The historical context explained some of what I was experiencing, but it also meant I was living in a house where people had died, where tragedy had layered itself into the walls over generations, and where the boundary between past and present seemed unusually thin. I decided to document everything that happened, keeping a journal by my bed and using my phone to record audio whenever I felt the temperature drop or heard unexplained sounds. The recordings caught things I could not explain. Voices that sounded like children whispering, though the words were never quite clear enough to understand. The sound of someone playing piano, even though the house had no piano and had not for decades, according to Richard. Footsteps that moved through rooms in patterns that suggested someone walking the same path over and over, perhaps a route they had taken in life. The most disturbing recording came from late October when I woke at 3 a.m. to find my bedroom door standing open, even though I had locked it before sleeping. I grabbed my phone and started recording, and for nearly 4 minutes you can hear what sounds like a woman humming a lullaby, soft and distant, coming from somewhere in the hallway. I showed the recordings to Richard when he came by for a scheduled maintenance check in early November. He listened to each one carefully, his expression growing more troubled as the evidence accumulated. Finally, he admitted what he had been reluctant to say before. Every tenant who had lived in the house for more than a few weeks had reported similar experiences. Most left within 3 months, unable to tolerate the constant feeling of being watched, the sounds that had no source, the cold spots that appeared without warning. He had hoped I might be different, that my skepticism and education would provide some immunity to whatever was happening, but he could see now that the house affected everyone eventually. He offered to let me break the lease without penalty, said he understood completely if I wanted to leave, but something in me resisted giving up so easily. I had spent weeks trying to rationalize these experiences, telling myself there had to be logical explanations, but hearing Richard confirm that this was a pattern, that the house had a documented history of affecting people this way, actually brought a strange kind of relief. I was not imagining things, and I was not losing my mind. The house was haunted, or at least it contained something that mimicked haunting closely enough that the distinction did not matter. I stayed through November and into December, partly out of stubbornness, and partly because I had started to feel a kind of responsibility toward whatever presence existed in the house. The fear that had dominated my first weeks gradually shifted into something more like wary coexistence. I would acknowledge the footsteps when they came, speaking aloud to let whatever it was know I could hear it. I stopped fighting the cold spots and instead wrapped myself in blankets when they appeared, accepting them as part of living in this particular space, and I started leaving small offerings, flowers on the table near where I had heard the children's voices, a candle lit in the window where the woman in the long dress had supposedly been seen. The activity did not stop, but it changed in character. The footsteps became less agitated, more peaceful, like someone simply going about their evening routine. The temperature drops felt less aggressive, more like passing through a doorway from one season into another. And one night in mid-December, I heard the piano music again, but this time it played a complete melody, something classical and beautiful that lasted for several minutes before fading away. I recorded it on my phone and later identified it as Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that would have been popular during the house's early decades. I left the Caldwell house at the end of December 2021, not because I was driven out by fear, but because my company decided to end remote work arrangements and I needed to return to Toronto. Richard seemed genuinely sad to see me go, said I had lasted longer than anyone in recent memory, and that he hoped the house had not been too difficult for me. I told him the truth, that it had been one of the most unsettling experiences of my life, but also one of the most fascinating, that I had learned to live with something I could not understand or control, and that there was value in that kind of discomfort. Sometimes I think about the Caldwell house, about whether the new tenant is experiencing the same phenomena I did, whether they are frightened or curious or resigned. I wonder if the children who died in 1873 are still there in some way, playing in rooms that no longer exist in the configuration they remember. I wonder if the maid who fell or jumped is the woman at the window, still watching for something, or someone who never came. And I wonder if houses absorb the emotional residue of their history, becoming repositories of grief and loss that express themselves to anyone sensitive enough to notice. I do not have answers to any of these questions, but I know the Caldwell house changed how I think about what is possible, about the spaces between rational explanation and lived experience, about the ways the past refuses to stay buried in houses that have witnessed too much tragedy. Running a farm in the Niagara region was never supposed to be easy, but by the spring of 2020, I was starting to understand just how much work my grandfather had handled before his stroke left him unable to manage the property anymore. The 120 acres of mixed crops and orchard land stretched along the escarpment edge, with views that tourists paid good money to photograph during harvest season. I had moved back from Hamilton at 28 years old, leaving behind a decent career in logistics to take over the family operation because there was nobody else willing or able to do it. My parents had retired to British Columbia. My sister had no interest in farming, and the thought of selling land that had been in our family since 1897 felt like betraying everyone who had worked it before me. The problem was that I had grown up on this farm but never actually learned to run it. I understood the basics from childhood summers helping with harvest, but the daily management, the equipment maintenance, the crop rotation schedules, all of that was knowledge I needed to acquire quickly while also keeping everything operational. By late April, I realized I could not do it alone, especially with apple season approaching and the vineyard rows needing constant attention. I put out word at the local feed supply stores and agricultural co-op that I needed experienced help, preferably someone who could commit to at least 6 months and who had worked mixed crop operations before. Most of the responses came from high school kids looking for summer work or retirees wanting part-time hours, neither of which matched what I needed. Then in early May, a man named Carl showed up at my door without calling first, said he had seen my notice at the Grimsby feed store and was interested in the position. He looked to be in his mid-40s, weathered in the way that outdoor work ages people, with calloused hands and forearms marked with old scars that spoke to years of manual labor. His name was Carl Brennan, according to the Ontario driver's license he showed me, and he said he had been working farms across southern Ontario for the past decade, mostly fruit operations and vineyards, moving from place to place depending on seasonal needs. Something about him made me slightly uncomfortable, though I could not pinpoint exactly what it was. He avoided eye contact when we talked, kept his answers brief and vague when I asked about previous employers, and had this habit of scanning the property constantly like he was cataloging escape routes or assessing vulnerabilities, but he also clearly knew farming, could identify equipment issues I had missed, and spoke knowledgeably about pest management and irrigation systems. I needed help badly enough that I ignored my gut feeling and offered him the job, with an agreement that he could park his small trailer on the back section of the property near the old equipment barn. For the first 3 weeks, Carl proved himself invaluable. He worked from sunrise until well past dark, never complained about the heat or the repetitive nature of vineyard maintenance, and fixed problems before I even knew they existed. He had a natural ability with machinery that saved me from calling expensive repair services multiple times, and he seemed to understand crop timing in ways that my book learning had not prepared me for. The only oddity was how much time he spent walking the back acreage, the 40 or so acres of mixed woodland and old pasture that bordered a creek running along the property's eastern edge. I rarely went back there myself since it was not actively farmed, just left as wildlife habitat and a buffer zone between our operation and the neighboring hobby farm. When I asked Carl why he was so interested in that section, he said he liked to walk after work to clear his head, that being around all the equipment noise during the day made him crave silence. It was a reasonable explanation, and I would have thought nothing more of it except that I started noticing he was making trips back there during lunch breaks too, always carrying the same worn backpack, always returning an hour later with dirt on his boots and sometimes scratches on his arms that looked fresh. He brushed off my concern when I mentioned he should be careful in the woods, said he knew what he was doing and had been working wild areas his whole life. Things shifted in early June when my neighbor Tom stopped by to borrow a post-hole digger. We were talking near the main barn when the conversation turned to a missing person case that had been all over the regional news for the past 2 weeks. A young woman named Jessica Hartman had disappeared from a Beamsville winery where she worked in the tasting room. Last seen leaving her shift around 9 at night, with security footage showing her walking to her car but never arriving home. Tom mentioned how it was the second disappearance in 6 months, that another woman had vanished from a St. Catherine's restaurant parking lot in January and still had not been found. I noticed Carl had stopped working on the tractor he was repairing about 20 feet away. He stood completely still, his back rigid, and when Tom kept talking about the police searching vineyards and wooded areas, Carl dropped the wrench he was holding. The clang of metal on concrete made both Tom and I turn to look, and I saw Carl's face had gone pale. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles were visible. He mumbled something about needing to check on his trailer and walked away quickly without making eye contact with either of us. That evening after Tom left, I found myself reviewing everything I knew about Carl, which was almost nothing. He had given me references that I never bothered to check because I needed help immediately. He paid for everything in cash, which he said was because he preferred not to deal with banks after having his identity stolen years ago. He never went into town for meals or supplies, just kept to himself on the property except for his daily walks to the back acreage. And most troubling, he had shown up looking for work right around the time the first woman had disappeared. I started paying closer attention to his routine, noting when he left for his woodland walks and timing how long he was gone. The trips were getting longer, sometimes stretching to 2 hours during his lunch break, and he always came back with that same backpack that looked heavier when he returned than when he left. One afternoon in mid-June, when I knew he had driven into Grimsby for supplies, I walked back to the creek area myself, following the path I had seen him taking through the trees. The woods were thicker than I remembered, overgrown with underbrush that made walking difficult, but there was a clear trail worn into the ground from repeated use. As I got closer to the creek, I started noticing things that did not belong. Areas where branches had been deliberately arranged to cover something, fresh digging in several spots near the water's edge, and tool marks on trees that suggested someone had been using them to anchor or lean equipment against. One particular area near a bend in the creek looked especially disturbed, with soil that was clearly newer than the surrounding ground and vegetation that had been transplanted to make it look natural but had not taken root properly yet. I stood there for probably 20 minutes trying to convince myself there were innocent explanations, that maybe Carl was burying garbage or had found a dead animal that needed disposal, but the size and shape of the disturbed area made my hands shake. It was roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, exactly the dimensions you would expect if someone was trying to hide something that needed to stay hidden. I did not dig, did not touch anything, just took several photos with my phone and walked back to the house, trying to decide what to do with suspicions that might destroy a man's life if I was wrong. That night, Carl must have sensed something had changed because he avoided me completely, staying in his trailer and not coming out for the evening barn check we usually did together. I lay awake until nearly 3 in the morning, debating whether to call the police with nothing but a gut feeling and some disturbed soil, knowing how ridiculous it would sound, knowing that I might be ruining an innocent man's reputation based on paranoia. But then I thought about Jessica Hartman's parents, who had been on television begging for information, and the other woman, whose name I could not remember, but whose face had been on missing person posters at the feed store, and I knew I could not live with myself if I did nothing. I called the Niagara Regional Police non-emergency line at 7 in the morning and tried to explain my concerns as rationally as possible. The officer who took my report sounded skeptical, but said they would send someone out to take a statement given the active missing persons investigations. 2 detectives arrived around noon. A woman named Detective Sarah Kovach and her partner, whose name I did not catch. I showed them the photos I had taken, walked them through Carl's behavior changes and his reaction to the news about the disappearances, explained about the long, unexplained absences to the back acreage. They asked to speak with Carl, but when we went to his trailer, it was empty. His truck was gone, and when Detective Kovach looked inside the trailer through the window, she immediately called for backup. They entered the trailer with a warrant that arrived within 2 hours, and I watched from a distance as they carried out evidence bags containing items I could not identify from where I stood. Later that afternoon, Detective Kovach told me they had found documentation in the trailer linking Carl to both missing women, including personal items that belonged to Jessica Hartman, and what appeared to be a detailed journal describing his activities over the past 6 months. They brought in search teams with dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment, concentrating on the areas I had photographed near the creek. By evening, they had found Jessica Hartman's body in one of the disturbed patches, buried shallow and poorly concealed. The second woman, whose name I learned was Maria Santos, was found approximately 40 feet away 2 days later during a more extensive search of the entire back acreage. Both women had been killed by strangulation, according to the preliminary forensics reports that were shared with me as the property owner. Carl Brennan, whose real name turned out to be Robert Carl Henderson, was arrested 3 days later at a motel in Kingston, where he had fled after realizing I had discovered his burial sites. The investigation revealed he had been fired from a vineyard operation in Prince Edward County in January under suspicious circumstances, had worked briefly at 2 other farms before coming to mine, and was wanted for questioning in connection with 3 other missing persons cases across southern Ontario dating back to 2018. The journal found in his trailer detailed his method of selecting victims who worked evening shifts at isolated locations, his preference for properties with wooded areas near water, and his belief that farm owners were too busy with daily operations to notice what happened on remote sections of their land. The trial happened over a year later in the fall of 2021. I had to testify about discovering the disturbed soil and Carl's behavior, about how I had hired someone without properly vetting them because I needed help and he seemed competent. The prosecutor used my testimony to establish how Henderson had deliberately sought out farming positions that gave him access to private land where he could hide evidence, moving from property to property whenever he sensed suspicion or simply when seasonal work ended. He convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder with evidence from the journal and forensics tying him to both deaths, and received life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. I sold the farm in 2022, unable to continue working land where 2 women had been murdered, while I went about my daily routine oblivious to their presence. The guilt of not acting sooner, of not checking Carl's references, of ignoring the warning signs that seemed so obvious in retrospect, made it impossible to stay. A development company bought the property and announced plans to turn it into estate homes, which seemed fitting somehow, erasing the agricultural history and replacing it with something that held no memory of what had happened there. Sometimes I think about the moment Carl's wrench hit the concrete, the sound that made me first question who I had invited onto family land, and I wonder how many other farmers across Ontario have hired drifters and seasonal workers without truly knowing who they are or what they might be hiding. The police told me I did the right thing by reporting my suspicions, that I potentially saved other lives by preventing Henderson from continuing his pattern, but that reassurance does not stop the dreams, where I am walking through those woods, finding disturbed soil everywhere I look, knowing that beneath the ground are answers to questions families should never have to ask. Taking a summer job at Clearwater Lodge in Muskoka seemed like the perfect escape after finishing my 3rd year at Ryerson University in Toronto. I was 21 that May of 2018, burned out from exams and desperate for 3 months of fresh air and decent pay before my final year started in September. The lodge was one of those upscale wilderness retreats that catered to wealthy families and corporate groups, offering guided canoe trips and fishing expeditions on lakes that still looked like they did 100 years ago. The job posting promised staff accommodation, meals included, and tips that would supposedly cover most of my tuition for the fall semester. What it did not mention was the isolation, how far we would be from anything resembling civilization, or the fact that the nearest town with a proper police station was over an hour away, on roads that became impassable during heavy rain. I arrived at Clearwater Lodge in late May, driving north from Toronto through increasingly remote highways until I turned onto a gravel road that wound through dense forest for another 30 minutes before reaching the property. The main lodge sat on the shore of a pristine lake, surrounded by smaller cabins where guests stayed, with staff quarters tucked into the trees behind the kitchen building. The owners, Richard and Margaret Sutton, were a couple in their 60s who had run the operation for almost 20 years, and they gave me a quick orientation before introducing me to the other seasonal staff. There were 8 of us total that summer, mostly university students like me, plus a head guide named Marcus, who had been coming back to work at the lodge every season since 2010. My responsibilities included housekeeping, helping with meal service, and occasionally assisting with guest activities when they needed extra hands for larger groups. The work was physically demanding but straightforward, and I fell into a comfortable routine within the first week. Most of our guests were families with young children or middle-aged couples looking for an authentic wilderness experience without giving up hot showers and decent food. But in mid-June, we had a different kind of booking, a corporate retreat for a tech company from Mississauga, about 15 professionals who wanted team-building activities and canoe instruction before heading out on a 3-day backcountry trip. One of the guests from that group stood out immediately. Her name was Amanda Chen, and she was probably in her early 30s, friendly and enthusiastic about learning outdoor skills, despite admitting she had grown up in downtown Toronto and had never been camping before. She asked detailed questions during the canoe safety demonstration, took notes during Marcus's orientation about reading topographic maps and identifying landmarks, and seemed genuinely excited about the upcoming trip. We talked briefly during dinner service the night before the group departed, and she mentioned this was her first real vacation in 2 years, that she had been working 80-hour weeks and needed to disconnect completely from technology and work stress. The corporate group left early on a Thursday morning in late June, paddling out in a convoy of 6 canoes loaded with camping gear and food supplies. Marcus was leading them, along with another experienced guide named Trevor, who worked summers at the lodge while teaching high school in Barrie during the school year. The plan was straightforward: paddle north to a designated campsite on the next lake, spend 2 nights there doing team-building exercises, then return to the lodge by Sunday afternoon. Richard emphasized to the group that they would be truly off-grid during this time. No cell service, no emergency communication except for the satellite phone Marcus carried, and that they needed to follow all safety protocols exactly as instructed. Sunday afternoon came and went with no sign of the group returning. Richard was not immediately concerned, mentioning that delays were common when inexperienced paddlers got tired or weather slowed progress. But when darkness fell and they still had not arrived, he tried calling Marcus on the satellite phone. It rang through, but nobody answered, which was unusual but not unprecedented if Marcus had the phone packed away in a dry bag or was in the middle of navigating a difficult stretch of water. By Monday morning, Richard was genuinely worried. He took one of the lodge canoes and paddled out to the campsite location himself, returning 5 hours later with an expression that made my stomach drop before he said anything. The corporate group was gone from the designated campsite. All their gear was packed up and the fire pit was cold, suggesting they had left the previous morning as planned. But Marcus and Trevor had told Richard over dinner the night they arrived at the campsite that the group was struggling more than expected, that several people were developing blisters and one woman was feeling ill from sun exposure, and they might need an extra day before attempting the return paddle. More troubling was what Richard found about half a kilometer from the campsite. One of the canoes pulled up onto shore and partially hidden in underbrush, with 2 paddles left beside it but no sign of who had been using it or why they would abandon equipment. Richard called the Ontario Provincial Police from the lodge's landline, and by Tuesday afternoon we had search and rescue teams arriving by floatplane and setting up a command post in the lodge's main dining room. They interviewed all the staff about the group's departure, about Marcus and Trevor's experience levels, about typical routes and any hazards that might cause problems for inexperienced paddlers. I told them about my conversation with Amanda, how excited she had seemed, how she had mentioned wanting to disconnect completely from her normal life. The officer, taking my statement, wrote everything down carefully, but I could see he was most concerned about the timeline, about why a group that should have returned Sunday afternoon had seemingly vanished without any distress calls or obvious signs of trouble. The search expanded over the following days, with helicopters flying grid patterns and rescue boats checking every inlet and island in the region. They found the rest of the canoes on Wednesday, all beached on a small island about 8 kilometers from the designated campsite in a direction that made no sense given their planned route. The canoes contained most of the camping gear, but the food supplies were gone, as were the personal backpacks belonging to the guests. More disturbing was the condition of one canoe, which had what appeared to be blood on the gunwale edge and a long crack in the hull, consistent with hitting rocks at high speed. I watched the search operations from the lodge, still expected to maintain normal duties for the handful of guests who had not canceled their reservations after news broke about the missing group. The atmosphere was surreal, serving breakfast to families on vacation while rescue teams coordinated search patterns and dive teams prepared to check deeper water sections. Margaret had to close the kitchen on Thursday when 3 staff members quit without notice, too frightened to stay in a place where 15 people could simply disappear. I considered leaving too, but something kept me there. Maybe a sense of responsibility to Amanda and the others. Maybe just morbid curiosity about what could have happened. On Friday afternoon, they found the first body. A diver searching the water near where the canoes had been discovered located Trevor, floating approximately 20 feet below the surface, caught in submerged tree branches from an old logging operation. The cause of death was listed as drowning, but the autopsy later revealed blunt force trauma to the back of his head, consistent with either hitting something during a fall or being struck by a hard object. The discovery shifted the entire search operation, with investigators now treating this as a potential crime scene rather than just a wilderness accident. Marcus was found 2 days later, on Sunday morning, by a search team checking a rarely used portage trail between lakes. His body was partially concealed under fallen branches, about 30 meters off the main trail, and unlike Trevor, the cause of death was immediately obvious. He had been shot twice in the chest with what investigators later determined was a 9mm handgun. The revelation that someone had brought a firearm into the wilderness and used it to kill the head guide changed everything about how authorities understood what had happened to the corporate group. The investigation that followed consumed the rest of the summer and made national news. Clearwater Lodge closed permanently in July, unable to recover from the publicity and the constant presence of police and media on the property. I gave multiple statements to OPP detectives who were trying to piece together what had gone wrong during that canoe trip, whether there had been conflicts within the group that might have escalated, whether Marcus or Trevor had mentioned any concerns about specific individuals. The working theory that emerged over months of investigation was that someone in the corporate group had a violent breakdown, possibly triggered by the stress and isolation of the wilderness environment, and had attacked the guides before fleeing with others who may have been forced to go along, or who panicked and scattered into the forest. They never found Amanda Chen or any of the other 13 corporate guests. The search continued sporadically through the fall of 2018 with specialized teams checking areas that were inaccessible during summer, but Algonquin Park and the surrounding wilderness comprises thousands of square kilometers of forest, lakes, and terrain where a person could disappear completely if they walked far enough from established routes. The OPP eventually classified it as an active missing persons investigation with strong suspicion of foul play, but without bodies or witnesses. There was limited progress beyond identifying that something terrible had happened on that island where the canoes were found. I never went back to Muskoka after that summer. The experience of watching a search operation fail to find people who should have been easily located in a defined area haunted me in ways I still struggle to articulate. I changed my major that fall from environmental studies to social work, maybe because I needed to feel like I was helping people in concrete ways rather than appreciating wilderness that suddenly seemed hostile and dangerous. Sometimes I search online for updates about the Clearwater Lodge disappearances, hoping that someone has finally been found, or that new evidence has explained what happened during those missing days between Thursday morning when the group broke camp and Sunday afternoon when they should have returned. The detail that bothers me most is thinking about Amanda Chen, who was so excited about disconnecting from technology and experiencing something authentic, and how that desire for wilderness adventure became something none of them survived or returned from. Marcus and Trevor knew those lakes better than almost anyone, had guided hundreds of trips over the years without serious incident, yet something happened that was violent enough to leave one dead in the water and another shot twice and hidden off a trail. Whatever occurred on that island, whether it was a sudden attack or a gradual breakdown of group dynamics under the pressure of isolation, it was thorough enough that 13 people vanished into terrain that is heavily searched and regularly traveled by outdoor enthusiasts. The Ontario Provincial Police still maintain a tip line for information about the disappearances, and every few years there are reported sightings in remote areas that generate brief renewed interest before proving to be false leads or cases of mistaken identity. I do not expect Amanda or the others will ever be found, at least not in my lifetime. The wilderness in that region is simply too vast, too dense, too capable of hiding things that people desperately want discovered. I learned that summer that disappearing completely is easier than most people realize, that even in Ontario, even in areas that seem accessible and civilized, there are places where people can be erased so thoroughly that no amount of searching will bring them back. House sitting seemed like easy money when my aunt's friend Carol offered me the job in March of 2022. She needed someone to watch her historic property in Stratford for 6 weeks while she traveled through Europe, and the pay was generous enough that I could take time off from my construction job without worrying about rent on my apartment in Kitchener. Carol was in her early 70s, a retired theater costume designer who had bought the Victorian mansion on a quiet residential street near the Avon River back in the 1990s. She gave me a thorough walkthrough the day before she left, showing me which radiators needed bleeding, where the circuit breakers were located, and how to work the temperamental washing machine in the basement laundry room. The house was exactly what you would expect from someone who had spent decades in theater. Every room was decorated with period furniture, vintage photographs in ornate frames, and shelves full of leather-bound books that looked like they belonged in a museum. Carol mentioned the house had been built in 1889 by a lumber baron named Theodore Whitmore, and that much of the original interior remained intact, including the elaborate crown molding, pocket doors between rooms, and a servant's staircase that connected the kitchen to the second-floor bedrooms. She seemed proud of the property's history, walking me through each floor and pointing out architectural details that most people would never notice. What Carol did not mention, or maybe chose not to emphasize, was how many rooms the house contained. I counted 14 separate spaces across 3 floors, not including the attic access or the basement storage areas, and most of them were furnished, but clearly unused. Guest bedrooms with beds made up in elaborate quilts that looked like nobody had touched them in years. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookcases and a reading chair positioned by the window. a sewing room filled with Carol's old theater equipment, dress forms standing like silent witnesses in the corners. The sheer size of the place meant that I spent most of my time in just 3 rooms: the main floor kitchen, the living room with the television, and the second floor bedroom Carol had designated for me to use. The first 2 weeks passed without incident. I established a routine of checking the house each morning to make sure nothing had leaked or broken overnight, spending my days exploring Stratford and catching shows at the Festival Theater, then returning in the evenings to make dinner and watch television before bed. The isolation did not bother me initially. In fact, I appreciated having space to myself after years of living in cramped apartments with thin walls and noisy neighbors. But somewhere around the middle of the 3rd week, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable in ways I struggled to articulate. It began with doors. I would close the door to my bedroom before going downstairs for breakfast, only to find it standing open when I came back up an hour later. The first time it happened, I assumed I had simply forgotten to close it properly, that maybe the latch had not caught and the door had drifted open on its own. But it kept happening. Always the same door, always standing wide open in exactly the same position when I returned. I started testing it, making sure the latch clicked firmly into place, even leaning against the door to confirm it was secure. Within an hour, it would be open again. Then I started noticing sounds from parts of the house I was not using. Footsteps on the 3rd floor, directly above my bedroom, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth, creaking from the attic access panel in the hallway ceiling, as though someone was putting weight on it from above. The sound of doors closing in distant rooms. That distinctive click of a latch catching that you cannot mistake for anything else. At first, I tried to rationalize these sounds as normal house settling, the kind of noises that any old building makes as temperatures change and materials expand or contract. But the footsteps had rhythm and pattern. The door sounds came at specific times, usually between 2 and 4 in the morning, and the attic creaking seemed to follow me as I moved through the 2nd floor hallway. By the 4th week, I could not ignore the feeling that I was being watched. It was strongest in the upstairs hallway, that specific stretch between my bedroom and the main staircase, where the servants' stairs also emerged from a narrow door most people would not notice. I would walk that hallway and feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, feel my breathing get shallow, feel an overwhelming urge to turn around and look behind me even though I knew, rationally, that nobody else was in the house. The feeling got so intense that I started taking the main staircase down and then walking all the way around through the 1st floor to reach different 2nd floor rooms, just to avoid passing through that particular section of hallway. One Tuesday evening in early April, I decided I needed to systematically check every room in the house to prove to myself that I was alone. I started on the 3rd floor, opening each door and turning on every light, looking in closets and behind furniture, confirming that the spaces were empty except for Carol's stored belongings and unused furniture. The 3rd floor had 5 rooms, all showing clear signs of disuse with dust on surfaces, and air that smelled stale from lack of circulation. I worked my way down to the 2nd floor, checking the 4 guest bedrooms, the bathroom, the sewing room, finding nothing except the expected contents of a home that had been carefully maintained but not fully inhabited. It was when I opened the door to the linen closet at the end of the 2nd floor hallway that I found the first thing that should not have been there. Behind the stacked sheets and towels pushed back, against the wall where you would not see it unless you moved everything aside, was a small pile of food wrappers and an empty water bottle. The wrappers were from granola bars, the kind sold in bulk at any grocery store, and the plastic bottle was a common brand of spring water. None of it belonged to me, and none of it looked old enough to have been there since before I moved in. The wrappers were not dusty. The bottle still had condensation marks inside, like it had been used recently. My hands were shaking when I pulled out my phone and called Carol. She was in Rome according to her itinerary, and it took several tries before she answered. I explained what I had found, trying to keep my voice calm, and asked if she had any explanation for why there would be recent trash hidden in her linen closet. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought we had lost connection. Then she said something that made my chest tighten with genuine fear. She told me that every house sitter she had hired over the past 5 years had reported similar experiences. Doors opening on their own, sounds from empty parts of the house, the feeling of being watched, and occasionally, evidence that someone or something was accessing areas that should have been sealed or unused. Carol admitted she had not told me because she needed someone to watch the house, and most people refused once they heard about the problems. She said she had called police multiple times over the years, that they had searched the property thoroughly and found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone living in the spaces between walls or hiding in the attic. One officer had suggested that the house's age and complex layout created acoustic anomalies that made sounds seem to come from impossible locations, that the door issue might be related to foundation settling affecting how frames sat in their openings. But Carol knew, and I could hear it in her voice, that something about the house was not right, that it had been not right since she bought it 30 years earlier. After hanging up, I stood in that hallway for a long time, trying to decide whether to leave immediately or finish the remaining 2 weeks. I needed the money, needed it badly enough that walking away felt financially irresponsible, but staying meant sleeping in a house where someone or something had been present without me knowing, had been close enough to hide trash in a closet I passed multiple times every day. I decided to set up my phone to record video overnight, positioning it to capture the hallway outside my bedroom door, hoping that I would either catch evidence of an intruder or prove that nothing was happening and I was just experiencing paranoid delusions brought on by isolation. The video I captured that night showed my bedroom door opening at 2:47 in the morning. Not slowly like wind or settling would cause, but deliberately, with the handle turning down and the deter swinging inward in one smooth motion. The camera angle did not capture what was on the other side, just the door opening and then nothing happening for nearly 3 minutes before the door closed again in the same deliberate way. I watched that footage at least 20 times, zooming in as far as the phone's camera quality allowed, looking for strings or mechanical explanations, finding nothing that explained how a door with a latching handle could open and close on its own. I moved my sleeping location to the first-floor living room, after that, dragging blankets down and setting up on the couch where I could see both the main entrance and the base of the staircase. I did not sleep well, waking at every small sound, but at least I felt like I had some control over my environment, rather than being trapped in a second-floor bedroom with a door that would not stay closed. The footsteps continued overhead, now clearly audible from my new position, pacing back and forth in what I knew was the empty hallway between guest rooms. On my last full day at the house, I decided to check the basement more thoroughly. Carol had only shown me the laundry area during her initial walkthrough, but the basement was much larger, extending under most of the house's footprint with multiple storage rooms and what looked like old servants' quarters from when the house would have had live-in staff. Most of the basement rooms contained exactly what you would expect: holiday decorations in labeled boxes, old furniture covered with sheets, shelves full of theatrical props and costume pieces from Carol's career. But in the furthest room, behind a heavy wooden door that stuck when I tried to open it, I found a space that looked like someone had been living there. There was a sleeping bag spread on the concrete floor, a battery-powered lantern, and several cardboard boxes containing food supplies, mostly non-perishables like crackers and canned goods. A plastic bucket in the corner had clearly been used as a makeshift toilet, and the smell in that room was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste and stale air that made me gag. What disturbed me most was the journal lying next to the sleeping bag, a small notebook filled with handwritten entries that documented someone watching the house, watching me specifically. The entries described my routine in detail: what time I woke up each morning, where I went during the day, when I returned in the evening, what I ate for dinner, what television shows I watched. The handwriting was neat and controlled, suggesting someone methodical rather than mentally disturbed, and the observations went back weeks, starting before I even moved into the house. The most recent entry, dated the previous day, noted that I had started sleeping on the first-floor couch, and that this change in pattern suggested I was becoming aware of their presence. I took the journal and ran up the basement stairs, not bothering to close the door behind me, and called 911 from my cell phone while standing in Carol's front yard. The Stratford police arrived within 15 minutes, and I showed them what I had found in the basement. They searched the entire property with multiple officers, checking every closet, every storage space, the attic, the crawl spaces, finding nothing except that one room with evidence of occupation. They took the journal as evidence and told me they would process the sleeping bag and other items for fingerprints and DNA. The investigation revealed that someone had been accessing the house through a basement window at the back of the property. One of those high windows near ground level that opened into the old coal room. The lock on it had been broken for years, according to Carol, and she had never bothered to fix it because the window was too small for anyone to use as an entry point, or so she thought. Whoever had been living in the basement was thin enough to squeeze through, drop down to the coal room floor, and then access the rest of the basement and potentially the entire house whenever they wanted. Police never identified who it was. The fingerprints did not match anyone in their system, and the DNA analysis came back without hits in any database. Carol had the basement window permanently sealed and installed a comprehensive security system throughout the house, but she told me later that she was considering selling the property, that knowing someone had been living there without her knowledge for potentially years had destroyed any sense of safety she once felt. I finished the final 3 days of my house-sitting commitment, but did not sleep at all during that time. Just sat in the living room with all the lights on waiting for dawn. Sometimes I think about that journal and the detailed observations of my daily life. I think about how many times I walked past that basement door without knowing someone was down there, watching me through cracks in floorboards or listening to my footsteps overhead. I think about the bedroom door that kept opening, and I wonder if it was their way of testing whether I would investigate, whether I would come looking for them, or whether they simply enjoyed the psychological game of making me doubt my own perceptions. Most of all, I think about the fact that they were never caught, that somewhere in Stratford, or maybe somewhere else entirely, there's a person who knows how to live inside someone else's home without being detected, who finds satisfaction in documenting the routines of people who believe they are alone. Working at the Lakeshore Conference Center on the western edge of Lake Simcoe felt like the ideal job for someone who wanted peace and quiet after years of retail management in Toronto. I was 32 when I accepted the position as facilities coordinator in April of 2017, responsible for maintaining the property, organizing event logistics, and overseeing the small staff that handled housekeeping and food service for corporate retreats and wedding bookings. The center sat on 20 acres of waterfront property just outside Barrie, with a main lodge building, 6 guest cabins, and a boathouse that extended out over the water on an old dock system that probably needed replacing, but had held up for 40 years, according to my predecessor. The property's owner, Margaret Chen, was a businesswoman from Markham who had purchased the conference center in the late 1990s as an investment property and rarely visited except for quarterly board meetings. She had warned me during my interview that some staff members were superstitious about the lake, that there were local stories about unusual sightings and unexplained phenomena, but she attributed this to the isolation and the tendency of people who spent too much time near water to let their imaginations run wild. I nodded along, not particularly concerned about folklore or ghost stories, more focused on the practical challenges of managing a property that hosted events year-round, despite being located in an area that experienced harsh winters. My first month passed without anything unusual beyond the normal adjustment period of learning where everything was stored, which vendors were reliable, and how to work with the permanent staff who had been there longer than I had. There were 5 of us total working full-time at the center. Myself, 2 housekeepers named Rita and Susan who had both grown up in the area, a maintenance worker named Dale who handled repairs and groundskeeping, and a cook named Thomas who prepared meals for whatever groups were staying at the property. Everyone was friendly and professional, though I noticed they all had certain habits that seemed odd until I understood the context. Nobody went down to the boathouse after sunset. When I asked why, Dale mentioned that the lighting was poor and the dock was slippery. Better to avoid accidents by just staying away after dark. Rita and Susan refused to clean the cabin closest to the water, the one we called Lakeside Cottage, unless they could do it together during daylight hours. They said it was because the cabin had plumbing issues that sometimes required calling Dale for help, but their discomfort seemed more psychological than practical. And Thomas would sometimes pause while working in the kitchen, staring out the window that overlooked the lake before shaking his head and returning to his tasks without explanation. The first incident that made me question whether there was substance to the local superstitions happened in late May. We were hosting a pharmaceutical company retreat, about 40 people spread across the cabins and main lodge, with team-building activities scheduled on the beach and group dinners in our main dining hall. On the second night of their stay, around 11 in the evening when I was doing my final property check before heading home to my apartment in Barrie, 3 of the guests came running up from the beach area looking genuinely frightened. They said they had been walking along the shoreline when they saw something in the water about 50 meters offshore. Something large that was moving against the current and creating a wake that did not match any boat or known aquatic animal. I went down to the beach with them, bringing a powerful flashlight we kept for emergencies, and scanned the water where they pointed. The lake was calm that night, with barely any wind, and visibility was decent under a nearly full moon. At first, I saw nothing except the normal play of light on water, the gentle movement of small waves reaching the shore. But then, about 60 meters out, I saw what they were talking about. Something dark was moving through the water, creating a disturbance pattern that suggested something large just beneath the surface. The wake it created was too substantial to be a fish, even a large sturgeon, and the movement was too purposeful, too directed to be debris or a log drifting with currents. We watched it for probably 5 minutes, during which time it seemed to parallel the shoreline, maintaining roughly the same distance from land. One of the guests, a man who said he had grown up sailing on the Great Lakes, commented that whatever it was moved like something with intelligence, like it was patrolling or searching for something, rather than just swimming randomly. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the disturbance stopped. The water returned to its normal gentle motion, and we saw nothing further, despite standing there for another 20 minutes, scanning with the flashlight. I filed it away, as unusual but not necessarily alarming. Probably just a large fish, or maybe even a seal that had somehow made its way inland, though I knew seals were not common in Lake Simcoe. But when I mentioned it to Dale the next morning while he was repairing a fence near the main lodge, his reaction made it clear this was not an isolated occurrence. He said sightings like that happened several times every summer, always after dark, always in the same general area of the lake near our property. The locals had stories about it going back decades, maybe longer, and some of the indigenous communities around Lake Simcoe had traditional accounts of a water creature they called by names I could not quite pronounce. Dale showed me an article he kept saved on his phone from a 1952 Barrie Examiner newspaper that described multiple witnesses reporting a large serpent-like creature in the lake near Kempenfelt Bay. The accounts were surprisingly detailed, describing something dark-colored with what appeared to be humps breaking the surface, moving at speeds that seemed impossible for any known fish species. Similar sightings had been reported periodically throughout the 20th century, with enough consistency in the descriptions that cryptozoology enthusiasts had given it a name, Kempenfelt Kelly, after the bay where most sightings occurred. Over the following weeks, I started paying more attention to what happened on the property after dark. I noticed that Dale always made sure equipment was secured and boats were pulled up onto shore well before sunset, and that he never went near the water's edge once natural light faded. Rita mentioned casually one afternoon while we were setting up for a wedding that her grandfather used to fish commercially on Lake Simcoe and refused to go out at night after an encounter in 1973, where something bumped his boat hard enough to nearly capsize it, something he described as being bigger than his 18-foot vessel. The second major incident happened in mid-June during a 3-day wedding event. The bride and groom had rented the entire property for their families, probably 70 people total, and had planned an evening ceremony on the beach at sunset, followed by a reception in the main lodge. Everything went perfectly until the ceremony was wrapping up, just as twilight was giving way to full darkness around 9:30. Several guests who had been standing near the water's edge started pointing and shouting, and I ran down from where I was supervising the catering setup to see what the commotion was about. There was something in the water, much closer to shore than what I had seen in May, close enough that we could see it clearly in the fading light. It looked like a dark mass about 6 or 7 feet long, breaking the surface intermittently as it moved parallel to where people were standing. What made it especially unsettling was the sound it made, a kind of deep rumbling that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears, something that reminded me of large marine mammals, but seemed wrong for fresh water and wrong for anything that should exist in Lake Simcoe. The wedding photographer, who had been documenting the ceremony, managed to get several shots of the disturbance before it submerged and disappeared. Later, when I looked at his photos, they showed clearly that whatever was in the water was substantial and animate, definitely not a log or debris, but the images were not clear enough to definitively identify what species or type of creature it might be. The photographer posted the images to his professional social media accounts, and within days, they had been picked up by local news outlets and cryptozoology websites, bringing attention to our property that Margaret Chen was not particularly happy about. We started having problems after that media attention. Guests who had reservations would call to ask if the property was safe, if there was any danger from whatever was in the lake. Some canceled their bookings entirely, spooked by the publicity or by reading about the history of sightings in the area. Margaret told me to downplay the incidents, to assure potential clients that Lake Simcoe was completely safe and that any unusual sightings were probably just large sturgeon or other native fish species that looked strange in certain lighting conditions. But the sightings continued through the summer, becoming more frequent as the weather warmed. In July, we had 3 separate incidents within a 2-week period, where guests reported seeing something large in the water near our shoreline. One couple from Richmond Hill said they watched it for nearly 30 minutes from their cabin window, describing it as serpent-like, with what appeared to be multiple humps creating an undulating pattern as it moved. Another guest, a biologist from the University of Toronto who was at the center for a research conference, observed it through binoculars and said the movement patterns were unlike anything he was familiar with from freshwater species. The situation escalated in early August, when we had livestock go missing from the small farm area we maintained on the property. Margaret had always kept a few chickens and goats for decorative purposes and to provide fresh eggs for guests, and they were housed in coops and pens about 100 meters from the waterline. Over 3 consecutive nights, we lost 5 chickens and one of the young goats, with no obvious sign of how a predator had accessed the enclosures. Dale checked for holes in the fencing, for signs of bears or coyotes, finding nothing that explained how something had gotten in and removed the animals without leaving blood or feathers or any normal evidence of predation. What we did find were tracks leading from the empty goat pen down to the water's edge. They were not paw prints or hoof prints, but something else entirely, drag marks interspersed with what looked like wide flipper impressions in the mud, as though something had pulled itself up onto land, taken the goat, and dragged it back toward the lake. Dale took photographs of the tracks before rain washed them away, and when he showed them to a Ministry of Natural Resources officer who came out to investigate the livestock loss, the officer's only comment was that he had never seen anything like them and had no explanation that would fit with known species in the area. I started sleeping at the property in August, partially because we were fully booked with back-to-back events, and it was easier than driving to Barrie every night, but also because I wanted to observe what was happening firsthand rather than relying on second-hand accounts from guests and staff. I set up in one of the guest cabins with a clear view of the lake and kept binoculars and a camera with a telephoto lens beside the bed. For the first few nights, nothing unusual happened. Beyond the normal sounds of a property near water, loons calling, waves lapping against the dock, wind moving through trees. Then, on a night in late August, when the moon was dark and the only light came from stars and the distant glow of Barrie across the water, I heard the sound that Dale and Rita had mentioned, but I had never experienced personally. It was that deep rumbling, felt as much as heard, coming from the direction of the boathouse. I grabbed my camera and binoculars and went down to the beach, moving slowly and quietly, not wanting to scare away whatever was making that sound. The boathouse was maybe 200 feet from my cabin, and as I got closer, I could hear other sounds mixed with the rumbling. The creak of the dock under weight, water sloshing against pilings, and something that sounded like breathing, heavy and rhythmic. I crept up to within about 50 feet of the boathouse, using trees and darkness as cover, and raised the binoculars to get a better look. What I saw made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the binoculars. There was something on the dock, something large and dark, that had pulled itself partially out of the water. In the starlight, I could make out a shape that was wrong for any aquatic animal I knew of. Too massive for a seal, too elongated for a beaver or otter, with what appeared to be a broad flat head and a body that tapered back into the water. It was moving slowly across the dock toward the boathouse structure, making those rumbling sounds, and I could see water streaming off its body, reflecting what little light was available. I stood there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, watching this thing move with obvious effort on land, its body undulating in a way that suggested it was not comfortable outside water, but was capable of operating there for short periods. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it slid back into the lake with barely a splash, and the rumbling sound faded as it moved away from shore. I walked back to the cabin, climbed into bed, and lay there until dawn trying to process what I had seen. In the morning, I went down to the boathouse to look for evidence, finding deep scratches in the wooden dock boards that looked fresh, and puddles of water in places that should have been dry given that we had not had rain in several days. I took photographs of everything, then called Dale to come look. He stood on the dock for a long time, examining the scratches and the disturbed areas before finally saying what I already knew. Whatever was living in the lake near our property was not just passing through. It was actively using our shoreline for purposes we did not understand, and it was substantial enough to damage our infrastructure and take livestock when it wanted to. I reported everything to Margaret, including my own sighting and the physical evidence on the dock. She was silent for a long time after I finished talking, then told me she had known about the sightings since before she bought the property in 1999, that the previous owner had sold it at a significant discount because guests and staff had been reporting unusual activity for years. She had gambled that the sightings would stop or that she could manage the property successfully despite them. But the recent escalation in frequency and the media attention had made her reconsider whether the business was viable. The conference center closed permanently in November of 2017. Margaret cited maintenance costs and declining bookings, but everyone who worked there knew the real reason. The property sold in early 2018 to a developer who planned to tear down the existing structures and build luxury condominiums. though last I heard the project had stalled indefinitely after the new owners also experienced unusual incidents and decided the location was not suitable for residential development. I moved to a similar position at a hotel in Aurelia, staying away from waterfront properties, preferring the relative safety of urban environments where the only mysteries were of the human variety. But sometimes I think about that night on the dock, watching something that should not exist pull itself onto land and move through our property with clear purpose and intelligence. I think about the local stories that go back generations, and the indigenous accounts that predate European settlement, and I wonder how many creatures like Kempenfelt Kelly exist in bodies of water we assume we understand completely. Mostly, I wonder what it wanted when it came onto our dock, what it was doing in the boathouse, and whether whatever lives in Lake Simcoe is still there, still occasionally coming ashore, still being seen by people who have no framework for understanding what they are witnessing. Purchasing the abandoned farmhouse on Longwoods Road in Chatham, Kent, seemed like a calculated risk when I signed the papers in March of 2021. I was 29, working remotely as a software developer, and the Toronto housing market had priced me out of any reasonable property ownership. The farmhouse had been vacant for 7 years, according to the real estate listing, sitting on 5 acres of overgrown land about 15 minutes outside of Melbourne. And the price was so low that I assumed there were structural issues or environmental problems that would explain the discount. What the listing did not mention, and what the real estate agent carefully avoided discussing until after the sale closed, was the property's history of unexplained phenomena that had driven away 3 previous owners in less than 15 years. The house itself dated back to 1842, one of those solid stone constructions that early Scottish settlers built to last generations, with walls nearly 2 feet thick and small windows designed to retain heat during harsh Ontario winters. The interior had been updated minimally over the decades, with electrical wiring that looked like it dated from the 1960s, and plumbing that functioned but needed constant attention. My plan was to renovate slowly while living there, upgrading systems as I could afford them, turning the property into something I could eventually sell for a decent profit or settle into long-term, depending on how remote work evolved. I moved in on a Saturday in early April, hauling boxes of belongings and basic furniture into rooms that smelled of damp plaster and old wood. The house had a strange layout, typical of additions made over different eras, with the original 2-room stone structure forming the core and various wooden extensions added in the late 1800s and early 1900s, creating a maze-like arrangement of bedrooms, pantries, and storage areas that did not follow any logical flow. The local historical society had a file on the property when I stopped by to research its background, showing that it had been continuously occupied from 1842 until 1999, when the last long-term residents moved out citing personal reasons the documents did not elaborate on. The first week passed normally enough, with me focusing on basic cleaning and assessing what renovations were most urgent. I noticed some oddities that I attributed to the house's age and vacancy. Doors that I clearly remembered closing would be standing open when I came back to a room hours later. Cold spots in certain areas that did not correspond to windows or obvious drafts, and a persistent smell in one of the upstairs bedrooms, something organic and unpleasant that I could not locate despite checking for dead animals in the walls or roof spaces. Things escalated on my 9th night in the house. I was asleep in the main floor bedroom I had set up as temporary living quarters when I was woken around 2 a.m. by what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor directly above me. Heavy scraping sounds, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone was rearranging a room. My first thought was that an animal had somehow gotten into the upstairs, maybe a raccoon or even a feral cat, but the sounds were too sustained and too purposeful for wildlife. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, my heart pounding harder with each step. The upstairs hallway was empty and silent when I reached the top. I checked each of the 4 bedrooms systematically, finding nothing disturbed, no signs of intrusion, no animals hiding in corners. The furniture in every room was exactly where it had been when I had last been up there during daylight. I stood in the hallway for several minutes, listening, hearing only the normal settling sounds of an old house and my own breathing. Then, just as I was convincing myself I had imagined the whole thing or had been woken by a dream, the scraping sound started again, this time seemingly coming from the attic space above the 2nd floor. I did not have easy access to the attic. The only entry point was a small hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, one of those pull-down ladder arrangements that looked like it had not been used in decades. I dragged a chair over, stood on it, and pushed the hatch panel up, immediately releasing a cascade of dust and the smell of old insulation. The scraping had stopped again, but I pulled the ladder down anyway and climbed up into darkness, sweeping my flashlight beam across an attic space that ran the length of the original stone structure. What I found up there made no sense given that the house had been vacant for 7 years. There were recent disturbances in the dust on the floor, paths where something or someone had walked repeatedly between the hatch opening and the far end of the attic. More unsettling was an area near the stone chimney where items had been arranged in a precise circle, old farm tools, pieces of broken furniture, and what looked like stones from the property arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate rather than random. In the center of this arrangement was a leather-bound book, its pages brittle and foxed with age, containing handwritten entries in ink that had faded to brown. I took the book down to the kitchen and spent the next 3 hours reading by the light of my laptop screen, too unnerved to go back to sleep. The entries dated from 1889 to 1892 and appeared to be some kind of diary or record kept by someone named John McDonald, though whether that was the property owner or a resident was not clear from context. Most of the entries described daily farm activities, weather conditions, crop yields, the kind of mundane information any farmer might record. But interspersed with these ordinary notes were passages that described phenomena MacDonald could not explain. He wrote about objects moving on their own, tools that would be in completely different locations from where he had left them, doors that refused to stay closed or latched. He described hearing footsteps and voices when no one else was in the house, seeing shadows that moved independently of any light source, and experiencing what he called tremendous crashes that would wake the entire family but leave no evidence of what had fallen or broken. The entries grew increasingly distressed over the 3-year span, with MacDonald questioning his own sanity and expressing fear that something malevolent had taken up residence in the house. The final entry, dated November 1892, was particularly disturbing. MacDonald wrote that he had consulted with a local minister who told him the property might be cursed due to its location, that Scottish settlers in the 1840s had sometimes unknowingly built on sites that indigenous peoples considered spiritually significant or dangerous. The minister had performed what MacDonald described as a blessing or cleansing ritual, and MacDonald expressed hope that this would end the disturbances. The diary ended there, with no indication of whether the ritual had been successful or what had ultimately happened to the MacDonald family. I researched the property's history more thoroughly after finding that diary, visiting the Chatham, Kent Library, and consulting with local historians who specialized in early settlement patterns. What I learned made me seriously reconsider whether I should stay in the house. The MacDonald family had lived there from 1887 to 1893, leaving suddenly and selling the property at a significant loss according to land registry records. The next family lasted only 4 years before also leaving abruptly. Over the house's 179-year history, the average occupancy period was less than 10 years, with multiple families leaving after shorter stays that the records described vaguely as relocated or moved for personal reasons. Most telling was when I showed a photocopy of one of the diary pages to a historian at the University of Western Ontario who specialized in paranormal folklore. She immediately recognized the descriptions as matching a phenomenon documented in Scottish and Irish immigrant communities across Ontario in the mid-1800s, something they called the disturbances that manifested as poltergeist-like activity in certain homes. She said there were dozens of documented cases in southwestern Ontario between 1830 and 1900, with the most famous being the Baldoon Mystery near Wallaceburg, where a family experienced violent poltergeist phenomena for several years before abandoning their property. The historian suggested that some of these cases might have been hoaxes or explicable through natural causes like settling foundations or underground water channels, but others defied rational explanation even when investigated by skeptics. She gave me the name of a researcher who had spent years studying the Baldoon case and suggested I contact him if I was experiencing similar phenomena, that he might be able to provide context or even visit the property to document what was happening. I did not contact the researcher immediately, partly out of pride and partly because I wanted to observe things myself before bringing in outsiders. Over the following weeks, the activity escalated in frequency and intensity. The furniture dragging sounds became nightly occurrences, always around 2 in the morning, always from areas of the house I was not currently occupying. Objects started appearing in impossible locations. My laptop would be on a kitchen chair when I clearly remembered leaving it on the desk upstairs. Books would be stacked in precise pyramids in the middle of rooms. Tools from the basement would show up in the attic, arranged in those same circular patterns I had found initially. The most disturbing development was the fires. Small ones at first, a dish towel that somehow ignited on the kitchen counter while I was in another room, a piece of paper that burst into flames on my desk with no apparent ignition source. I installed smoke detectors in every room and kept fire extinguishers readily accessible, but the fires continued to start spontaneously, always small enough that I could control them quickly, but frequent enough that I was constantly anxious about being asleep or away from the house when a larger fire might start. I documented everything with my phone camera and started keeping my own diary of incidents, noting dates, times, exact descriptions of what happened. The pattern that emerged was unsettling in its consistency. Activity peaked during new moon phases and seemed strongest in the original stone portion of the house rather than the later additions. The sounds of furniture moving always came from empty rooms, and when I set up cameras to record those rooms, the footage would show furniture actually moving, scraping across floors with no visible force causing the motion. In late June, I finally contacted the researcher, whose name the university historian had given me. His name was Dr. Martin Fletcher, and he had been studying unexplained phenomena in historical Ontario properties for over 30 years. He drove out from London to visit the property on a Tuesday afternoon, bringing equipment that included electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and audio recording devices. He spent 6 hours walking through the house, taking measurements, recording baseline readings, and asking detailed questions about every incident I had experienced. What he told me before leaving was both validating and deeply unsettling. He said the property showed all the hallmarks of what parapsychologists call a residual haunting overlaid with active poltergeist phenomena. The residual aspect was like a recording, energy from past events replaying over and over, which explained the consistent timing and pattern of certain manifestations. But the poltergeist activity, the moving objects and spontaneous fires, suggested something more interactive, something that was responding to my presence, or perhaps being amplified by it in ways current scientific models could not fully explain. Dr. Fletcher referenced the Baldoon case extensively, noting that the phenomena I was experiencing matched almost exactly what the MacDonald family had reported in 1829 at their settlement near Wallaceburg. That case had involved objects flying through the air, spontaneous fires that started and extinguished themselves, physical attacks on family members, and sounds of phantom construction as though invisible workers were building or destroying structures. The Baldoon disturbances had lasted from 1829 to 1831 before ceasing as mysteriously as they had begun, with no satisfactory explanation ever established despite investigations by skeptical observers from Toronto and Detroit. He suggested I document everything meticulously, that cases like mine were rare enough to be scientifically valuable, even if they defied current understanding of physical laws. He offered to install more sophisticated monitoring equipment and to stay overnight during peak activity periods to observe firsthand. But he also cautioned me that living in the house long-term might not be psychologically sustainable, that several people who had experienced similar phenomena in other properties had eventually left for their own mental health, regardless of their initial skepticism or determination to understand what was happening. I stayed through July and into early August, partly because I had invested everything I had into the purchase and could not afford to simply abandon the property, and partly because I wanted to understand what was happening. The activity continued unabated, with new manifestations appearing that had not been documented in the historical accounts. I started hearing voices, not clear enough to understand words, but definitely human-sounding conversations coming from empty rooms. I would find handprints in dust on surfaces I had just cleaned, adult-sized handprints that were not mine. And on 3 separate occasions, I woke to find every door in the house standing open, interior and exterior, despite having locked everything before bed. The final incident that drove me out happened on a Saturday morning in mid-August. I came downstairs to find the entire kitchen rearranged, furniture moved into different configurations, dishes and cookware stacked in elaborate towers on the floor, and a message written in what appeared to be ash on the kitchen table. The message was in English, though the spelling was archaic, and it read, "Leave while you are able. This ground belongs to them who came before." Whether this was a legitimate supernatural warning or somehow a product of my own mind, I could not determine, but seeing those words written by an unknown hand in my own kitchen broke whatever determination I had left to stay. I moved out that day, taking only essential belongings and leaving most of my furniture and possessions behind. The property went into foreclosure 6 months later when I stopped making mortgage payments, and last I checked, it remains vacant with no serious buyer interest despite being relisted at an even lower price. Dr. Fletcher published a paper about the case in a parapsychology journal, using my documentation and his measurements to argue that some locations possess characteristics we do not yet understand that make them prone to recurring anomalous phenomena, regardless of who occupies them. Sometimes I wonder if the house is still active, if objects are still moving through empty rooms, and fires are still starting spontaneously with no one there to witness or extinguish them. I think about John MacDonald writing his diary entries in 1892 about all the families who came after him experiencing the same inexplicable disturbances, and about the fundamental, unsettling possibility that some places simply are not meant for human habitation, regardless of how solidly they are built or how desperately we want to believe that every mystery has a rational explanation waiting to be discovered. Finding an affordable apartment in Penetanguishene during the summer tourism season felt nearly impossible until I stumbled across a listing for the third-floor unit in what locals called the Beck House. I was 26 that June of 2019, working 2 jobs to save money for graduate school, and the rent was low enough that I could actually put aside funds instead of living paycheck to paycheck like I had been in Barrie. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gallagher, who lived in Aurelia and managed several properties around Simcoe County, seemed eager to fill the vacancy and did not ask many questions beyond confirming I had steady employment and decent credit. The Beck House was a Victorian mansion built in 1876 on a residential street that ran parallel to Penetanguishene Bay, close enough to the water that you could hear boats in the harbor on quiet mornings. The building had been converted into 3 separate apartments sometime in the 1980s, with the main floor and second floor each forming complete units, and the third floor where I would be living consisting of what had originally been the servants' quarters and attic storage. Mrs. Gallagher explained during my walkthrough that the building had historical designation from the town, meaning I could not make any modifications to the exterior or original architectural features, but otherwise I was free to decorate and furnish however I wanted. What she did not mention, and what I only discovered after moving in, was that the Beck house had a reputation in Penetanguishene that went back decades. The building was featured in local ghost tour narratives, appeared in regional folklore collections, and was well known among long-time residents as one of those places where strange things happened, with enough consistency that even skeptics gave it a wide berth. I learned this from my downstairs neighbor, a retired teacher named Patricia, who had lived in the second-floor unit for 8 years, and who stopped by with cookies on my 3rd day to welcome me and offer what she carefully described as context about the building's history. Patricia told me the basics over tea at my small kitchen table. The house had been built by William Beck, a lumber merchant who made his fortune during Penetanguishene's boom years as a major Georgian Bay port. He and his wife Eleanor had 7 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood, which was actually good odds for the Victorian era according to Patricia. The 2 who did not survive both died in the house, daughters named Margaret and Catherine, who succumbed to diphtheria in the winter of 1881 within a week of each other. They were 8 and 6 years old respectively when they died, and according to family records preserved at the local museum, their deaths devastated Eleanor Beck to the point that she never fully recovered psychologically. The connection to folklore came from reports that started circulating in the early 1900s after the Beck family had sold the house and moved to Toronto. New residents began experiencing phenomena they could not explain. Children's voices and laughter coming from empty rooms, the sound of running footsteps in upstairs hallways, toys and household objects appearing in odd locations, and most famously, figures of 2 young girls seen in the 3rd-floor windows by people passing on the street below. These sightings were consistent enough that by the 1920s the house had developed a reputation as haunted, and subsequent residents either embraced the story or tried to downplay it depending on their comfort level with such things. Patricia admitted she had experienced unexplained occurrences during her 8 years in the building, mostly sounds that seemed to come from my 3rd-floor unit, even when it was vacant, which it had been for 6 months before I moved in. She said previous 3rd-floor tenants rarely stayed more than a year, and some left after just a few months citing noise complaints and general unease. She emphasized that she was telling me this not to frighten me, but because she believed people deserved to know what they were moving into, and that Mrs. Gallagher had a pattern of failing to disclose the building's history to potential renters. I thanked Patricia for the information and tried to maintain a skeptical attitude as I unpacked and settled in. I had never been particularly superstitious, did not believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, and attributed most alleged hauntings to combinations of old building acoustics, suggestible witnesses, and the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in random events. The 3rd-floor apartment was charming, despite its sloped ceilings and cramped layout, with windows that provided excellent views of the harbor, and enough character in the woodwork and fixtures that I could overlook the less convenient aspects like the narrow spiral staircase that was the only access point. For the first 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened beyond what you would expect from living in a 143-year-old building. Floors creaked, pipes made strange noises when water ran through them. The whole structure seemed to shift and settle during temperature changes. I adjusted to the sounds and rhythms of the house, learning which floorboards to avoid if I did not want loud squeaking, where to step in the hallway to minimize noise traveling down to Patricia's unit, how to work the temperamental bathroom plumbing that sometimes took several tries to get hot water flowing properly. The first incident that made me question my skepticism happened on a Tuesday evening in early July. I was home alone, reading in the small living room area that occupied what had once been the main attic space, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a child laughing, not muffled or distant, but clear and immediate, as though there was a young girl in the room with me. I looked up from my book, scanning the apartment, seeing nothing. The laugh came again, bright and delighted, the kind of sound a child makes during play, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand up in response to something my rational mind could not categorize. I walked through the entire apartment, checking the bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, even opening closets and looking under furniture, finding nothing that could explain what I'd heard. The windows were closed, so it had not come from outside. Patricia was not home, according to her dark windows, when I checked for my living room. And the main floor unit was occupied by a couple in their 70s, who definitely did not have children visiting. I stood in the center of my living room for several minutes, listening, hearing only normal house sounds and traffic from the street below. Over the following weeks, the incidents accumulated with increasing frequency. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps running back and forth in the hallway outside my bedroom, fast and light, like a child racing through the space. Doors that I clearly remembered closing would be standing open, particularly the door to the small room I used as an office, which seemed to refuse to stay latched no matter how firmly I closed it. And several times I found items moved from where I had left them. My hairbrush appearing in the kitchen when I had used it in the bathroom, books reshelved in different orders, even my work shoes placed neatly side by side in the center of the living room floor when I had left them by the door. The most unsettling experiences involved direct observation of things that should not have been possible. One evening in late July, I was washing dishes when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I turned to look directly at the kitchen table and watched as one of the chairs slowly pulled itself back from the table, the wooden legs scraping across the floor in that distinctive sound that happens when someone sits down or stands up. The chair moved approximately 8 inches before stopping, and there was absolutely nothing I could see that would explain the motion. No strings, no vibration strong enough to cause that kind of movement. Nothing. I started documenting everything with my phone camera, setting it up to record when I left for work, trying to capture evidence of whatever was happening. The footage showed doors opening on their own, shadows moving across rooms when nothing physical passed through, and on one particularly disturbing recording, what appeared to be a small handprint appearing on the dusty surface of a window I had not cleaned, as though invisible fingers were pressing against the glass from inside the apartment. I showed the recordings to Patricia, who watched them with an expression that mixed concern and recognition. She said what I was experiencing matched historical accounts of activity in the house, particularly the children's footsteps and the sense of playful mischief rather than malevolence. She gave me a book written by a local historian in the 1990s that compiled folklore and reported phenomena from various Penetanguishene locations, and the chapter on Beck House contained testimonials from 8 different former residents or neighbors, describing experiences almost identical to mine. One account from 1947 described a family who lived in the house before it was divided into apartments, and how their daughter insisted she had 2 friends who would visit her room at night, girls named Margaret and Catherine, who wore old-fashioned dresses and wanted to play with her toys. The parents had dismissed this as imaginary friends until neighbors mentioned seeing 2 young girls in the 3rd-floor windows late at night when the daughter should have been sleeping alone in her room. Another account from 1982, after the building conversion, came from a woman who had rented the 3rd floor for 8 months before leaving. She described waking repeatedly to find children's toys arranged in patterns on her floor. Even though she owned no such toys and lived alone, she eventually discovered that one of her storage boxes containing items from her own childhood had been opened, and several old dolls and building blocks she'd forgotten about were being taken out and played with by something she never saw directly but could hear moving through the apartment after midnight. I tried researching Eleanor Beck and her 2 daughters, who died in 1881, finding their graves at a cemetery on the edge of town and locating period newspaper articles about their deaths. The articles described diphtheria sweeping through Penetanguishene that winter, taking several children from different families, and mentioned Eleanor Beck's profound grief in the kind of flowery Victorian language that seemed to barely contain the real anguish underneath. One article from later that year noted that Eleanor had commissioned a local artist to paint portraits of Margaret and Catherine, and that these paintings were displayed prominently in the 3rd-floor nursery, where the girls had spent most of their time before becoming ill. I wondered if those paintings still existed somewhere, if they were in storage at the local museum or had been passed down through the Beck family descendants. Something about knowing the specific details of the girls' lives and deaths made the phenomena in my apartment feel more personal and less frightening. These were not malevolent spirits or dangerous entities, just children who perhaps did not understand they were dead, or who were somehow imprinted on the house where they had lived their brief lives and experienced their suffering. In August, I had an experience that fundamentally changed how I understood what was happening in the apartment. I woke around 3 a.m. to find 2 figures standing at the foot of my bed, clearly visible in the moonlight coming through the window. They were young girls, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing long white nightgowns that looked Victorian in style. Their features were indistinct, like looking at someone through frosted glass, but their shapes and sizes were definite and obviously human. They stood there for what felt like several minutes, but was probably less than 30 seconds, just watching me, and I was too frozen with shock to move or speak. Then one of them, the taller of the 2, reached out and touched the bed frame at the foot of the mattress, and I felt the bed shift slightly as though real weight had been applied. The other girl made a gesture that might have been a wave or might have been something else, and both figures faded gradually until they were gone, leaving me staring at empty space with my heart pounding so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. I did not sleep the rest of that night. Instead, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, trying to process what I had seen and whether there was any possible explanation beyond the supernatural one that my mind kept returning to despite my lifelong skepticism. By morning, I had decided I needed to either accept that something impossible was happening in this apartment or move out immediately and abandon the good rent and convenient location. I chose to stay, partially out of stubbornness, and partially because the encounter, while frightening, had not felt threatening. The girls had simply stood there, observing, perhaps checking on the new person living in what had once been their space. Over the remaining months of 2019, I developed what might be called a coexistence arrangement with whatever presence occupied the 3rd floor. I would speak aloud sometimes when I heard footsteps or laughter, saying good morning or acknowledging that I heard them, treating the situation as though I had roommates who happened to be invisible and occasionally moved my possessions. The activity never stopped entirely, but it seemed to reach a kind of equilibrium. Doors still opened on their own, but less frequently. I still heard children's voices and footsteps, but they no longer startled me the way they had initially. And several times I woke to find small items placed carefully on my nightstand that had been in other rooms when I went to sleep, as though the girls were bringing me gifts or trying to communicate in the only way available to them. I moved out in March of 2020 when I got accepted to graduate school in Ottawa, not because I wanted to escape the haunted apartment, but because life circumstances changed. Patricia told me later that the unit stayed vacant for nearly 8 months after I left, and the new tenant, who eventually moved in, only lasted 3 weeks before breaking the lease and leaving without explanation. Mrs. Gallagher has since stopped trying to rent the 3rd floor, leaving it empty and apparently deciding that the income is not worth the hassle of constant turnover and tenant complaints. Sometimes I think about Margaret and Catherine Beck, about what it must have been like to be children dying of diphtheria in that third-floor nursery in 1881, surrounded by family who could do nothing except watch them suffer and eventually die. I think about Eleanor Beck's grief and whether her emotional trauma somehow imprinted on the building in ways that persist a century and a half later. And I wonder if the girls are still there, playing in rooms that have been divided and subdivided, appearing in windows to startle passers-by, moving objects, and making sounds that remind the living that the dead do not always leave the places where they suffered and died. Accepting the property management position for the Woodchester Villa seemed like the perfect opportunity when the offer came through in February of 2023. I was 34, working dead-end security jobs around Bracebridge, and the salary being offered to oversee this historic octagonal building was nearly double what I was making. The property owner, a numbered corporation based in Toronto, explained during my interview that the villa had been used for various purposes over its long history and was currently being maintained as a heritage site while they explored options for converting it into a boutique hotel or event space. My responsibilities would include daily security checks, coordinating maintenance contractors, managing the grounds, and serving as the primary point of contact for the occasional historical society tours that visited the property. The Woodchester Villa was located about 10 minutes outside of Bracebridge proper, set back from the main road on several acres of forested land that provided complete privacy from neighboring properties. The building itself was remarkable, an 8-sided structure built in 1882 by an eccentric American millionaire who believed octagonal architecture promoted better energy flow and healthier living. Each of the 8 walls was identical, with tall windows and intricate woodwork, and the interior was arranged in concentric octagonal rooms radiating out from a central spiral staircase that rose 3 floors to a cupola with panoramic views of the surrounding Muskoka landscape. I moved into the small caretaker's cottage on the property in early March, spending my first weeks familiarizing myself with the villa's layout and quirks. The building had been meticulously maintained despite limited use, with original fixtures and furniture preserved as they would have been in the late Victorian era. Each room was labeled with small brass plaques indicating its historical purpose: parlor, dining room, library, various bedrooms on the upper floors. The corporate owners had left detailed instructions about which areas required daily checks, where security sensors were located, and emergency procedures for everything from fire to break-ins to weather damage. What they had not mentioned, and what I only discovered through casual conversation with the Bracebridge Historical Society director when she brought a tour group through in late March, was the building's connection to a series of disappearances that had occurred in the area during the 1970s and 1980s. She mentioned it almost casually while showing the group through the main parlor, noting that the villa had been owned during that period by a family whose patriarch had eventually been investigated, though never charged, in connection with several missing persons cases involving young women who had worked as seasonal staff at various Muskoka resorts. After the tour group left, I pulled the director aside and asked for more details. Her name was Dr. Elizabeth Morton, and she had been researching Muskoka history for over 20 years. She explained that between 1976 and 1984, 6 women between the ages of 19 and 23 had disappeared from the Bracebridge and Huntsville area during summer tourist seasons. All had been last seen leaving their jobs at resorts or restaurants late at night, intending to drive or walk home. None of their bodies were ever found, and the cases remained officially unsolved, though they had generated significant police attention at the time. The villa's owner during that period was a man named Douglas Whitmore, grandson of the original builder, who had inherited the property in 1968 and lived there year-round until selling it in 1987. Douglas had been questioned multiple times by Ontario Provincial Police because 3 of the missing women had been seen in his company at various points before their disappearances, though always in public settings like restaurants or bars, where their interactions seemed casual rather than suspicious. Police had searched the villa twice with warrants, but found nothing that connected Whitmore to the disappearances, and he was never arrested or formally charged with any crime. Dr. Morton showed me newspaper clippings from the 1980s that detailed the investigation and the community tension it had created. Whitmore maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he had simply been friendly with the young women because he frequented the same establishments they worked at, and that he had been unfairly targeted because of his wealth and his somewhat reclusive lifestyle at the villa. After selling the property in 1987, he had moved to British Columbia and died in 2004, taking whatever knowledge he might have had about the disappearances with him. I spent that evening researching everything I could find about the case online, discovering true crime forums and unsolved mystery databases that discussed the Muskoka disappearances extensively. One thread included speculation that the villa's unusual octagonal architecture might include hidden spaces or compartments that police had missed during their searches, that the complex geometry of the building could conceal storage areas or even rooms that were not obvious from the main floor plan. Another suggested that the extensive property surrounding the villa, with its dense forest and proximity to lakes and marshes, would have provided ample opportunity to dispose of remains in ways that would make recovery nearly impossible decades later. I tried to push these thoughts aside and focus on my job responsibilities, but knowing the building's history changed how I felt moving through it during my daily security checks. The villa suddenly seemed less like a charming historical curiosity and more like a structure that might be hiding terrible secrets within its unusual walls. I started paying closer attention to details that had seemed merely quirky before, noticing how certain rooms had dimensions that did not quite match the exterior wall spacing, finding small doors and access panels that were not marked on any of the floor plans I had been given. In mid-April, I decided to conduct my own thorough measurement of the building's interior spaces compared to its exterior dimensions. Using a laser measuring tool and the architectural drawings the corporate owners had provided, I mapped out every room on all 3 floors, calculating total square footage and comparing it to what the exterior measurements suggested should be available space. The discrepancy was significant, nearly 400 square feet that could not be accounted for by normal wall thickness or mechanical systems. Somewhere in the villa's octagonal design were spaces that were not part of the official floor plan. I shared my findings with my contact at the corporate ownership office, a lawyer named Richard Chen, who handled property management issues. His response was immediate and concerning. He told me not to pursue this investigation further, that the building had been fully inspected by structural engineers and heritage architects before the corporation purchased it, and that any missing square footage was likely just a counting error or spaces occupied by the spiral staircase structure, which was more complex than typical straight-run stairs. His tone made it clear this was not a suggestion but a directive, and when I pressed for more explanation, he mentioned that reopening speculation about the Whitmore case could damage the property's value and reputation. I should have dropped it there. Should have focused on my job and left historical mysteries to people whose business it was to investigate such things. But something about Richard's response made me more rather than less curious, and I decided to look for the missing spaces myself during my regular security rounds. The most promising area seemed to be the second floor, where the geometry of the octagonal layout created complex intersections between rooms that could potentially hide access to concealed spaces. It took 3 days of careful examination before I found the mechanism. In what had been labeled as a linen closet in the northeast-facing section of the second floor, The back wall was actually a panel that could be slid aside if you knew where to apply pressure. Behind it was a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for one person to move through sideways, that ran between the outer wall and the interior rooms. The passage was maybe 40 feet long, following the building's octagonal perimeter, and it connected to two small chambers that had clearly been deliberately concealed during construction or renovation. Both chambers were empty when I found them, just small windowless rooms approximately 8 by 10 feet, with smooth plastered walls and hardwood floors that matched the rest of the villa. They smelled of old wood and dust, but there was nothing obviously sinister about them except the fact that they existed hidden within the building's structure. I photographed everything with my phone, documenting the concealed entrance, the passageway, and both rooms before carefully closing the sliding panel and returning to my cottage. That night, I called Dr. Morton and described what I had found. She was silent for a long time after I finished talking, then asked if I had contacted police. I admitted I had not, unsure whether discovering hidden rooms in a historical building constituted something that required immediate police involvement, especially given that the rooms were empty and showed no obvious signs of criminal activity. She suggested I report it anyway, that given the property's connection to the unsolved disappearances, investigators might want to examine the spaces with forensic equipment that could detect evidence invisible to casual observation. I called the OPP non-emergency line the next morning and explained the situation to the officer who answered. Within 3 hours, 2 detectives from the Major Crimes Unit arrived at the villa, accompanied by a forensics technician carrying equipment cases. Detective James Wong was the lead investigator, and he had me show them everything I had discovered, while his technician photographed and documented each step. When they entered the first concealed chamber, the technician immediately set up a portable UV light and began scanning the walls and floor. What they found made my stomach drop. Under ultraviolet light, the walls of both chambers showed extensive traces of what the technician identified as blood spatter, patterns that had been cleaned but never completely removed, because whoever did the cleaning had not known to check for residue that would only be visible under specialized lighting. The floor showed similar patterns, and in the corner of the second chamber, they found several long strands of hair that had been trapped in a gap between floorboards and the baseboard. Detective Wong told me to wait outside while they conducted a more thorough examination, and over the next 6 hours, I watched as more investigators arrived, carrying equipment ranging from ground-penetrating radar to chemical testing kits. They expanded their search to include the grounds immediately surrounding the villa, and by evening, they had marked off several areas where the radar suggested possible buried remains. The excavation began the following morning, with archaeologists and forensic anthropologists working carefully to uncover what the radar had detected. Over the course of 4 days, they recovered partial remains from 3 separate burial sites on the property, all within 50 meters of the villa's foundation. The remains were badly degraded after nearly 40 years underground, but DNA analysis eventually identified them as belonging to 3 of the 6 women who had disappeared between 1976 and 1984. The investigation that followed consumed the next several months and made national news. The OPE brought in specialists from Toronto to examine every inch of the villa and surrounding property, eventually discovering evidence that Douglas Whitmore had used the concealed chambers as holding areas before killing his victims and burying them on the property. Additional searches of other properties Whitmore had owned during the 1970s and 1980s led to the discovery of 2 more victims, bringing the total confirmed murders to 5, with 1 case still unsolved. The corporate owners immediately halted all plans for the property and put it up for sale, though finding a buyer for a building confirmed as a serial killer's operating base proved impossible. The villa was eventually donated to the Historical Society with the understanding that it would be preserved as a cautionary site, a place where tours could educate people about how easily monsters can hide in plain sight behind facades of wealth and respectability. I quit the property management position in July and moved to Huntsville, unable to continue working at a location where I had walked through rooms every day without knowing that just feet away, hidden behind false walls, were spaces where women had been held captive and murdered. The guilt of having been there for months before discovering the truth, of having walked past that linen closet dozens of times without recognizing what it concealed, made it impossible to stay. Dr. Morton told me later that I should not blame myself, that the chambers were expertly concealed, and that even the OPP searches in the 1980s had failed to find them because they did not have the benefit of modern forensic technology or the kind of detailed architectural analysis I had conducted. But knowing intellectually that I could not have discovered them sooner did not stop the dreams where I heard voices calling from behind the walls, or the persistent question of what might have been different if someone had found those rooms decades earlier, before Douglas Whitmore sold the property and disappeared into comfortable retirement. The families of the victims held a memorial service at the villa in August, before it was officially transferred to the Historical Society. All 5 families attended, grateful finally to have answers after 40 years of uncertainty, and several of them thanked me personally for making the discovery that brought closure to their decades of wondering. Their gratitude was genuine and deeply felt, but it did not erase the fundamental horror of knowing I had been living and working mere feet away from evidence of such deliberate, calculated evil. Photography has always been how I process the world, especially places that carry weight and history beyond what most people notice. In the summer of 2020, I was 27 and working freelance while building a portfolio focused on abandoned and historically significant Ontario locations. Someone on a local Urbex forum mentioned the old Rockwood Asylum grounds near Guelph, describing stone ruins scattered through forest near the Grand River that dated back to the 1850s. The asylum itself had closed in 1975 after operating for over a century as a psychiatric institution, and while most of the buildings had been demolished, several stone structures remained along with the foundation of the main building and various outbuildings that had been left to decay. I drove out to Rockwood on a Saturday morning in late June, parking at the public conservation area entrance and walking the trail system that wound through what had once been the asylum campus. The main administrative building and patient wards were gone, demolished shortly after closure, but the limestone walls of various utility structures still stood, some reaching 15 or 20 feet high, covered in vegetation and graffiti from decades of trespassing visitors. The atmosphere was immediately unsettling in a way I could not entirely attribute to knowing the location's history. The forest felt too quiet, with none of the usual bird calls or small animal sounds that should accompany a June morning in southern Ontario woodland. I spent the first hour photographing the obvious ruins, capturing angles that emphasized how nature was reclaiming the built environment, how trees grew through foundation cracks and moss-covered walls that once contained human suffering. The asylum had been known for harsh conditions during its early decades, with patients subjected to treatments that ranged from ineffective to outright cruel by modern standards. Overcrowding, disease, and occasional outbreaks of violence had marked its history. And between 1856, when it opened, and 1975, when it finally closed, hundreds of patients had died there and were buried in unmarked graves on the grounds. As I moved deeper into the property, following overgrown paths that suggested frequent use by other explorers, I started feeling distinctly uncomfortable. It was not fear exactly, more like the sensation of being watched by something that remained just outside my peripheral vision. Every time I turned to look behind me or scan the tree line, nothing was there except ruins and forest, but the feeling persisted and intensified the further I walked from the main conservation area. I found what appeared to be foundation remnants of patient cottages, smaller structures that would have housed 10 or 15 people each during the asylum's operation. These were in worse condition than the utility buildings closer to the trail, mostly just rectangular depressions in the ground with scattered stones marking where walls had once stood. Near one of these foundations, I noticed something that made me stop completely. There was a figure standing about 40 meters away, partially obscured by trees, wearing what looked like dark clothing and completely motionless. I called out, assuming it was another photographer or history enthusiast, but received no response. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge my presence in any way. I raised my camera and zoomed in through the telephoto lens, trying to get a better look at whoever was there. Through the lens, I could see more clearly that the clothing was old-fashioned, maybe institutional, the kind of plain dark dress or uniform that might have been worn by patients or staff a century ago. But the details were strangely unclear, like looking through frosted glass, and I could not make out facial features despite having a lens powerful enough to capture that level of detail from that distance. I lowered the camera and the figure was gone, not walked away, not moved behind trees, just completely absent from the spot where it had been standing seconds before. My rational mind immediately generated explanations. I'd been looking at shadows and tree shapes that resembled a human form. My eyes had played tricks after staring through a lens. The figure had simply moved very quickly while I was adjusting my camera settings. But none of these explanations felt adequate to what I had just witnessed. I continued photographing, moving through the ruins and trying to focus on my work rather than the growing unease that had settled over me. But the feeling of being watched intensified, and I started noticing other things that seemed wrong. Cold spots in areas that should have been warm given the June sunshine filtering through the canopy. Sounds that resembled distant voices or crying, so faint I could not be certain I was actually hearing them rather than imagining them. And shadows that moved independently of any obvious light source. Dark shapes that flickered at the edge of vision and disappeared when I tried to focus on them directly. Around noon, I reached what had been the asylum cemetery. It was marked with a small historical plaque that had been placed by the Conservation Authority, noting that over 300 patients were buried here between 1856 and 1975, most in unmarked graves that were only identified by numbered wooden stakes that had long since rotted away. The cemetery area was approximately half an acre, just a clearing in the forest, with uneven ground and occasional stones poking through the soil. Nothing marked it as a burial ground, except that plaque and the slight depressions that suggested sunken graves beneath the grass. I spent probably 30 minutes photographing the cemetery from various angles, trying to capture something of the sadness and neglect that hung over the place like fog. While I was composing a shot of the tree line beyond the burial ground, I saw movement through my viewfinder. Multiple figures this time, maybe 5 or 6 of them, standing among the trees at the clearing's edge. They were all wearing similar old-fashioned institutional clothing, all standing completely motionless and all looking directly at where I stood with my camera. I lowered the camera again, and they were still there, visible without the lens, dark shapes that held human form but lacked clear detail. We stayed like that for what felt like several minutes, but was probably less than 30 seconds, me frozen with my camera, them standing in that unnaturally still way, watching. Then one of them moved, not walking but gliding forward without visible leg movement, crossing maybe 10 feet closer to where I stood. The others remained motionless, but that single figure's approach was enough to break whatever paralysis had held me. I turned and walked quickly back toward the main trail, not quite running, but moving fast enough that I could hear my breathing getting labored and my equipment bag bouncing against my hip. I did not look back until I reached the area near the parking lot where other people were visible, families walking the conservation trails and couples having picnics near the river. Only then did I stop and turn to scan the tree line I had just emerged from, seeing nothing except ordinary forest and stone ruins in the distance. I drove back to my apartment in Guelph, feeling shaken in a way that went beyond simple fear. I had photographed abandoned hospitals, closed prisons, derelict industrial sites, and never experienced anything that challenged my fundamental understanding of how reality works. But what I saw at Rockwood could not be easily dismissed as imagination or environmental factors. The figures had been there, visible in normal light, and their appearance and behavior had been consistent with what countless other people had reported at that location over the decades since the asylum closed. That evening, I went through the photographs I had taken, over 300 images covering 5 hours of exploration. Most showed exactly what I expected: ruins and forest and interesting architectural decay, but approximately 20 images, all taken within the cemetery area or near the patient cottage foundations, showed anomalies I could not explain. In several shots, there were shadow shapes that resembled human forms in locations where I had not seen anything when taking the picture. In others, there were light anomalies, spheres, and streaks that could potentially be dust or lens flare, but that appeared in patterns suggesting intelligence rather than random distribution. The most disturbing image showed the cemetery clearing with what appeared to be dozens of translucent figures standing among the grave sites, all facing toward where I must have been standing when I took the shot. I had absolutely no memory of seeing these figures when composing the image, had not noticed anything unusual through the viewfinder yet. There they were in the final photograph, faint but unmistakably present. I posted several of the images to Urbex and paranormal investigation forums, asking if others had experienced similar phenomena at the Rockwood ruins. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of people shared their own experiences at the location, describing shadow figures, disembodied voices, physical sensations of being touched or pushed, and equipment malfunctions that only occurred on those grounds. Several mentioned the cemetery specifically as a focal point for activity, noting that approaching the burial ground seemed to trigger more intense experiences than exploring other parts of the ruins. One poster sent me a link to academic research conducted by a McMaster University psychology professor who had studied reported paranormal experiences at former institutional sites across Ontario. The research suggested that locations with traumatic histories, particularly mental health facilities where patients experienced prolonged suffering, showed statistically significant, higher rates of reported anomalous experiences compared to control locations. The professor theorized this might relate to environmental factors like electromagnetic fields or subsonic sound generated by specific architectural configurations, though he acknowledged the data was complex and did not fully support any single explanatory model. I returned to Rockwood twice more that summer, both times during daylight hours and both times with other photographers who wanted to experience the location after seeing my images. The phenomenon repeated itself with disturbing consistency. We all saw figures that appeared and disappeared, all experienced that oppressive feeling of being watched, and our collective photographic evidence showed similar anomalies despite using different cameras and different shooting techniques. One photographer, a woman named Sarah, who had 20 years of experience shooting abandoned locations, refused to return after our first visit together, saying the atmosphere at Rockwood was unlike anything she had encountered elsewhere, and that she felt physically ill for days after leaving the property. By September, I had compiled enough material for an exhibition focusing on Rockwood and several other historically significant asylum sites in Ontario. The show opened at a small gallery in Toronto and generated significant attention, both from people interested in the historical documentation and from those fascinated by the paranormal implications of the photographic evidence I had gathered. Several skeptics attended and offered alternative explanations for the shadow figures and light anomalies, ranging from pareidolia to technical artifacts in digital image processing, but none of them could explain the consistent pattern of experiences reported by dozens of independent witnesses, or the fact that the phenomena appeared primarily in areas of the property with documented histories of patient deaths and suffering. The exhibition led to an invitation to participate in a formal investigation of the Rockwood site organized by a paranormal research group affiliated with the University of Western Ontario. They brought equipment I had never seen before: electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, audio recording devices calibrated to capture frequencies outside normal human hearing range. Over 3 overnight sessions in October and November, the team documented extensive anomalous activity, including temperature fluctuations that could not be attributed to weather or environmental conditions, electromagnetic spikes that occurred in patterns suggesting intentionality rather than random variation, and audio recordings that captured what sounded like human voices speaking words that were almost but not quite intelligible. The research team's preliminary report, published in a parapsychology journal the following spring, concluded that the Rockwood Asylum ruins showed characteristics consistent with what researchers call residual hauntings, energy impressions from traumatic historical events that replay under certain conditions. But the report also noted interactive elements that suggested something beyond simple residual phenomena, instances where the activity appeared to respond to questions or presence of living observers in ways that indicated awareness and agency. I have not returned to Rockwood since that last investigative session in November 2020. The experience of spending entire nights in those ruins, surrounded by equipment registering presences we could sometimes see and hear but never fully understand, fundamentally changed how I think about consciousness and what might persist after death. Sometimes I look at the photographs I took there, studying the shadow figures and trying to imagine what they were in life, what suffering brought them to that institution, what keeps them tethered to those grounds decades after their physical bodies failed and were buried in unmarked graves that no one bothers to maintain.